All right. Hello, welcome everyone. We are starting a little bit early. It's about 3 or 4 minutes early today, so we're not going to jump in quite yet. Let everyone kind of get settled and into their seats, get their popcorn ready. Um, Basically, we started a little bit early, partially because we were running into some weird stuff we wanted to chase down before we were actually into the content, which is awesome because that's kind of what today's webinar is all about. So everyone kind of settle in, say hi in chat, and we'll get started here in a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes or so. But Dan, how are you?
I'm doing great, George. It's great to see you again, as always.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to this one. This is going to be a good webinar, and it's been a while since I've been on a webinar, so it's kind of exciting.
Yeah, this is my first webinar, so bear with me if I'm not as polished as perhaps you are, but we've done lots of live shows together, so I think this is going to be a fun,
It's the same
a fun
thing,
session.
only longer.
Yeah. I like the topic today as well, troubleshooting live streaming problems, because it's so relevant. It's something that I think everyone can relate to who's done any type of live streaming, and there's it's always good to sort of update and refresh on some of this information related to troubleshooting. So excited for this topic with you today.
Yeah, no, it's going to be great. So just looking at chat here, so a bunch of people saying hi. I got Sam and Jeffrey and Kramer and a bunch of Wayne, bunch of people saying hi. People from all over the place, from Seattle, Washington, Fremont, Michigan, Austria. This is great. So yeah, like I said, usually take a few minutes, let people settle in. Peter from London. That's great. See, the numbers are still building as well, so I want to make sure we don't leave anyone behind. So we just kind of let you guys come in a bit here. Mark saying hi from Germany. So this is great. Got a good global audience so far. That's awesome.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah, so let's see. Yeah, I'm still seeing those numbers tick up here a little bit. So
Kalamazoo, right on.
it's one of those favorite place names, right?
Right up there with Timbuktu.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's pretty good ones in Canada too, especially out of Newfoundland. But not safe for work, so we're not going to mention those here.
We might not mention that one,
no. But there's a place in Quebec called Saint Louis de Haha. Not joking. A friend of mine who's a comedian has actually performed there. So,
Oh, no kidding.
just makes it weird. It's a tiny, tiny little town, but the signs are hilarious. But it's, so a couple more people saying hi in the chat there. Andy from England, Etienne from Netherlands, David from North Carolina. So this is great. Great, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Again, I think we'll get started here in another minute or so, just seeing a few more people join us. Like I said, we don't want to leave anyone behind. So we just want to make sure everyone is in there. And before we jump into today's topic, let's see. All right. I think we're probably good to start. I'm starting to see those numbers stabilize. So again, welcome everyone to today's webinar. The topic today is live streaming problems, troubleshooting, tips, fixes, and all the things on how to make you more successful and hopefully avoid any problems with live streaming. It's going to be a fairly broad topic, and we are going to touch on just big conceptual things as well as some very specific things related to Epiphan products. For those of you not familiar with Epiphan already, hopefully you all are, and that's why you're here. But if you're not, Epiphan makes world-class video hardware for streaming, recording, and video capture, and so on and so on. We have a support team here at Epiphan, myself and the team on support. A lot of the questions and topics we're covering today are things that we encounter with our customers on a daily basis. And so we wanted to put this webinar together to help you guys. We love hearing from you, but it's always a little faster and a little easier to empower people to solve their own issues before having to call someone. We're obviously, of course, happy to help, but making sure that people can solve their own issues is important. We know about these things as well. As I mentioned, we started a little bit earlier today because we saw some weird anomalies we wanted to sort out before we were live. Because we do this on a weekly basis, whether it's these webinars we've been doing nearly weekly for the past 7 months, or whether it's our every week Thursday live at Epiphan shows that we do on Thursday afternoons, which both Dan and I have been on frequently over the past few years. So we understand this not just from a manufacturer perspective, but we understand this as someone doing it for real in the wild. We have encountered all of the things ourselves and found ways to solve them, and we want to, again, pass that knowledge on to you. So needless to say, we've seen it all, we've heard it all, and we've found ways to solve it.
Yeah, and we want to hear your questions as well. So definitely use chat, but let us know what live streaming issues you might be experiencing, and we'll try to help you on the fly here live in the webinar. You can also use the Ask a Question button. You're going to see it right under the video near the right. If you click that and enter your question there, then we can kind of see some polling on which questions are most relevant, and we can kind of answer them in the order that order of importance of what people want us to talk about most. So we'll also have a few polls that we'll be issuing throughout the session. So please participate in the polls. It's a great way to increase the engagement of the session and make this awesome for everybody.
One quick note, I guess, on the question thing as well is that there is an upvote arrow when someone else posts a question. So if you see someone else's question that you think is particularly relevant or of interest to you as well, instead of duplicating the question, just use that upvote, very Reddit style upvote system. It'll push it to the top of the queue so that when we get to the Q&A section, Dan and I will be able to spot those a little quicker and address those that seem to be more popular or more relevant first. So,
and can we troubleshoot one problem right now? I just
Sure.
I'm seeing in chat, and a couple people have mentioned that my audio was a little bit hot. I was peaking a little bit, so that's a nice point of feedback to get on the fly. One thing that I tend to have a very boomy voice, and when I get excited, I talk a little bit louder. So maybe my audio was a little louder than it was when we were setting up the session. So I think I've reduced it by about 3 or 4 decibels now. If I'm still too hot, let me know. But I was able to make a quick change on the fly using my microphone pack, and also I can make an adjustment right in my Perl encoder as well. So if I'm still coming in hot, just let me know, everybody.
All right, let's dive in today, and let's take a look at the agenda. So quick agenda here. We're going to break this down into some different sections. The first one is going to be troubleshooting for streaming in general as an overview. Some just very basic top-level things that you might want to look at. And we'll drill a little deeper into specific video things, common encountered issues, and how to solve them. Similarly with audio, after that, we'll basically address the same things that happen with audio in detail. The fourth one is a kind of a bigger section, but they're all somewhat related, and that is CDNs, streaming and network issues. CDNs being your streaming platform. I saw some people asking questions about YouTube already. YouTube is a CDN, so that section is going to be talking about that kind of stuff. And then the fifth section there, we will talk specifically about how to apply some of the previous topics to streaming with an Epiphan Perl in particular. And that is exactly what Dan and I are doing right now today. Both of us are streaming using Perls in our home offices to a central studio point where our producer, Adam Palmer, is streaming everything back out to you guys on Crowdcast. So we understand those workings very, very well. And then finally, we'll get to your Q&A at the end. If there's something that's really relevant in the questions when we're in a particular section, we may kind of pick that out as we go. But for the most part, we'll probably hold a lot of the generalized questions until the end. So, So why don't we dive in and see where this takes us on today's wonderful adventure, I guess. So troubleshooting for streaming as a high-level overview. Basically, streaming comes down to five components for pretty much all video productions. You have video sources, you have audio sources, you have some sort of video encoder, whether that's a hardware device or software on a computer. You have an internet connection, and you're going to be streaming it to somewhere. Typically, this is a CDN or a streaming platform or something that's redistributing the stream to hopefully your large number of viewers. Pretty much everything breaks down into that flow. And so we need to focus when we run into problems on precisely which one of these are we actually running into a problem. That's kind of the first step. And this is kind of just basic logical troubleshooting, right? If we're having a video issue, we need to understand what that is so that we can figure out whether it is in that first option of video sources. Maybe it's the camera, or maybe it's the video encoder that's doing something wrong, or maybe it's our internet connection that's doing something wrong, or maybe it's the streaming destination that's doing something wrong. Any of those are possibilities when we look at a bad video type of umbrella. So we need to narrow it down by understanding what we're looking at and identifying what we mean when there's a problem. So ways we can do this. We need to look at the different components, right? And don't think of them as one piece. They are individual pieces. They have their own individual points of failure, potentially. So from a video source perspective, for example, we want to verify physical connections. We then want to verify the encoder. We then want to verify our network connection and then verify our platform. So we don't want to start at the platform end often unless it's very clear that that's where the problem lies. The problem we had earlier actually is a great example. Our platform, Crowdcast, was reporting that we were not providing a decent enough bit rate for what they were expecting. This means it could most likely be an encoder issue. It could also be a network issue. And lastly, could be the platform, but unlikely. It turns out it was an encoder issue and was very simple to solve. So that's why we need to make sure we identify where in the chain, in this entire signal chain, we potentially are running into these issues. One of the best ways we can do this is, again, starting at the beginning of that chain, working through them, checking at various different points to the best of your ability to verify each step along the way. And of course, as we've said probably 1,000 times, you got to test. You can't just fly into it hoping that it's just, it worked once, it'll work the next time. No, it probably won't. You need to make sure that before every single attempt to stream, you test and verify a few different points of potential failure, just to make sure that you're not running into anything odd or surprising. Things can change even when you didn't change it. So it's important to keep that in mind. So.
And George, just to jump in here, it seems like you're recommending to start as close to the source as possible as you're starting to troubleshoot, to start at the source and work towards the endpoint is the general philosophy that you would recommend.
Yeah, exactly. And again, sometimes starting at the very beginning of the chain, your video source, for example, if that's your camera, and then the cable from the camera to your encoder, starting there might seem redundant if it looks like you're having an encoding issue, but that just means you're going to get through that section even faster. But just making sure you're doing that verification can make a huge difference. I have, in fact, encountered issues on several occasions where it looked like I started with the CDN side. I started with looking at my YouTube stream and said, that image doesn't look good. It's got to be my encoder, and started obsessing over the encoder. When it turns out that due to a faulty cable, the camera was not sending me the signal I thought I was. So the encoder was scaling it and messing with it, and the end result on the YouTube stream was bad. But the actual root cause was the camera. So you never know, and that's why it's a good reason. Even though you might think your gut says, it's the encoder, you might you might be wrong. So it's better to start at the chain, eliminate each step as you go through, just to make sure that everything is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And again, some of those steps will go really quickly if they are not the problem. So you're not really wasting time doing it because they'll go fast once you see, yep, done, next one. That's kind of the way to do it.
And another question, George, to sort of summarize this opening section, you really stress test, test, test. What is an appropriate amount of time to be budgeting for your testing? Is a half an hour enough time? Do you need to book an hour of time? What kind of recommendations would you make as far as how extensive testing should be and when you should do it?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that's going to depend on the gear that you're using as well as your familiarity with it. For us, before one of these webinars, we often budget somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes to gear up for one of these. Not all of that is just technical gear stuff, although that's happening in parallel. We're also typically reviewing the content, making sure it's fresh in our minds, looking through scripts, changing things last minute if we have to. But our producers are doing all of the video and audio verification in parallel at the same time. That's with us doing this on a weekly basis with gear we know intimately and generally an extremely stable infrastructure, even though we're doing everything remotely these days. If we were rolling out, and Dan, you know this from when you and I have done live streams from the field, right, at a trade show or something like that, if I'm doing that for the first time, there are so many more variables that could go wrong. I would actually test for a period of time the day before, and then again for an hour or whatever before I'm actually due to be live. I would do multiple tests, as many as I could. And not all of those have to be full tests. Some of them can be little micro tests, if you will. One of them being bandwidth, and we'll get more to that later. But that's probably one of the biggest ones where you cannot test enough when we're talking about bandwidth. That's such a common point of failure that you can overdo that all day if you like. But specifically video issues, again, cameras themselves tend to be pretty simple if you're familiar with the camera. But if it's a brand new camera, you've never used it before, who knows what could go wrong there. You probably want to spend quite a bit more time getting familiar with it. So video issues, wanted to start with talking about, and this is no joke, but oftentimes we get a phone call here at Epiphan Support that literally the customer will call us or jump on live chat or send us an email. And the entire description we get to start with is bad video. Well, what does that mean? That could mean 1,000 things. So we need to identify and qualify what is actually bad about the video. That's going to help us to find where the problem originates. Now, of course, we can go through the full chain. That's ultimately the best strategy. But we can try and fast forward through some of those points if we actually understand what it is that we're looking at. This example image here in this slide is talking about compression artifacts. That's a really extreme example. But generally speaking, if you're seeing something like that where there's missing blocks of data or smearing blocks of data in digital video, that's typically compression artifacting, meaning something has gone wrong in our encode. Something is not quite going right with the compression stage. But again, there could be a number of factors leading to that. So we need to think about those. So common problems that we see here from a bad video is a low resolution. Maybe it's pixelated or blurry. This could be a scaling issue. This could be the resolution settings on the camera, which I kind of mentioned earlier. I've run into before where I'm expecting full HD from the camera, but instead it sends me like 480p. That's a disaster, and it's going to cause encoding and scaling issues as well. So we need to check this. We need to verify the camera is actually set and is actually outputting what we want. That's a big critical step for sure. Check if there's anything in the chain that's causing any scaling, where we might be scaling down, usually not that bad, or scaling up, which is actually worse. Stretching up is going to make things look worse. And then, of course, the encoder resolutions might be doing some scaling there as well. The next very common one is frame rate issues. And this is maybe the actual number one thing that people run into. Video looking choppy, right? And there could be a lot of reasons that lead to this video looking choppy, but typically it's a case of dropped frames. We're just dropping frames. We're expecting 30 frames per second and we're only getting 20 or less, as an example. That's going to make the viewer experience very poor. It's going to make the content look less than ideal. And it's a very common frame rate issue. Most commonly cause of frame rate issues is system load on your encoding stage. Now, not always. There can be other places where it can happen too, but more often than not, your encoder could be overloaded. It can't keep up with the demands you're placing on it. And this is true whether it's a dedicated hardware appliance like a Pearl or whether it's a software encoder like OBS running on your computer. Best example of this is if you buy a $200 computer off of Amazon and think that you're going to live stream with OBS on it, sorry to disappoint you, but probably not very successfully. Not unless you're doing a very low resolution and you're willing to sacrifice frame rates. I know people who are trying to stream using, MacBooks that are only a couple of years old, and even trying to do it at 720 struggles to maintain frame rates because that's just what happens. Computers especially have a lot more overhead that can lead to the system load. The other one that can happen a lot is blocky video. Shapes, colors morph and distort. And that's what we were talking about earlier in the previous example. That's where our compression artifacting can come into play, where the way encoding works is you don't encode a full frame every single time. That would just be massive amounts of data. It's unreasonable to do that. So there's a certain amount of interpolation that happens every so often, which means that if encoding makes a mistake in that interpolation or there isn't enough data somewhere, and this is especially true in fast motion, then you might get weird blocky smearing or whatever. If that's the case, we need to increase our bit rate typically, or increase the keyframe interval in some cases. But we're not getting the quality we want if we're blocky. So we need to increase that. So we want to look at some of those things. Let me just see. Sorry, I'm getting notes here. Are we getting any questions in chat there at all, Dan?
We have a few questions coming in.
Okay.
Some questions about, one of the upvoted questions we have right now is about persistent stream keys. So I don't know if you want to get into that now or if we can...
No, we'll save that for later.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a bit of a bucket of worms potentially. So we'll get to that one a little later.
Yeah, just looking here. I see a question here. We often have to deal with HDCP issues as we try to stream here on campus. What's the best way to verify that you have HDCP blocking a video source and how to overcome HDCP issues?
That's a tough one, and we might want to save that one as well because that's HDCP is almost a webinar unto itself in some ways. So maybe let's save that one as well. But generally speaking, if HDCP is being used, it's being encrypted on your signal from your source or somewhere along the chain, and your encoder or your capture card is not HDCP compliant, which is pretty much all of them, you're going to result in a no signal. basically. It's going to be black or staticky or nothing at all. That's the quick rundown. But we can definitely dive into that one because that's a great example of one to look at. Not that common, but one to definitely look at. All right, so if we come back into the common problems, one of the things, and I know, Dan, you've run into this a bunch in your own stuff, flickering video. So here's where our signal might be cutting in and out, or we're just getting flashes of half frames and stuff like that.
It's sometimes a hard issue to diagnose, which, where is this flickering being introduced? Is it happening on the encoder? Is it happening on the streaming platform? Is my monitor flickering? There's a lot of different variables there, which I think kind of brings up one of the tips generally about video issues is to actually try to monitor your stream both locally and at the final destination and see if there's any discrepancies there. So if you have, for instance, a camera that has a screen on it, check there first. I think it's, again, going back to the philosophy of starting at your source for checking video issues. Start at the source with your camera. If you have a viewfinder or you have like a folding screen on your camera, see if it's flickering first. If it is, then the problem is inside of your camera. And then working out from there, your cable, your HDMI cable or your connection.
So funny enough, in prepping for this webinar, you and I were kind of joking around that at separate times, but very commonly, and I've seen this with customers as well, very commonly, it can be the cable or even the physical port on the camera. Some of them are quite fragile, and it doesn't take much to damage the physical port to the point where it won't maintain a stable connection, no matter how many cables you try. So, you definitely want to check on that. But again, if you plug that same cable into just a regular monitor or TV, bypass your encoding chain completely and see what happens. Wiggle the cable just ever so slightly, see if that impacts it, that kind of thing. But checking physical cables and physical ports is honestly one of the most common ones when it comes to flickering video. So that's a big one. And I can say there is a shelf in the office that has several cameras on it that are broken and unusable because of exactly this. So it definitely can happen. So next one is video buffering. So this is kind of related to maybe the third one we mentioned as well in terms of things like bit rates. Buffering is most likely a bandwidth issues, but you could have caused the bandwidth issue by having too high of a bit rate. So finding the balance is important. But buffering is an interesting one because if you as the creator are seeing buffering in your dashboard, then there could be bandwidth issues at your site. If your confidence looks good and your dashboard looks good, then, and it's your viewers that are seeing buffering, first you have to ask, is it all viewers or only a couple of them? Because it might be their bandwidth that's the problem. You might be trying to deliver something that's a little too high quality for some of the people who are viewing it. So bandwidth is typically the issue with buffering, some sort of weak connection. Let's see, and then the sixth one here that's kind of a common one is no video, a black screen, or no signal warning. And this is actually a great place to kind of highlight again. HDCP encryption could cause this, but it also could be caused by, again, coming back to number 4, a physical video issue somewhere routing along the way, lack of power. That's one of the points. Whether if you're using a switcher, you're on the right the right one. I've done that a couple of times myself. And then of course, there are some cameras out there, and I do encounter this a lot, especially at the low end with cameras. The video source you're using might not actually be suitable for streaming because it doesn't provide a live output. This is one I encounter on a very regular basis with entry-level camcorders, where some of them only provide an HDMI output when it's in playback mode and not during its live just view. Of course, if it doesn't provide us a live view signal, it's not suitable for streaming as a camera. So you want to look at changing that camera for something else. So that's one. But this one, again, it's all about verifying that signal chain, looking at the camera. Is it actually providing us an output? Is the cable good? Is the port good? Can I send it to something like a television? And then come back to the encoder and see if the encoder might be causing us some issues there. So some of the tips here, Dan, maybe take us through a couple of the tips here for better video. What do we need to really have to have that better video?
Yeah, definitely. Just coming back to, as we mentioned before, to actually monitor your video signal at the source and at the final destination, you can really isolate where you might be having problems by seeing if there's any discrepancies there. Number 2, interlaced video. Avoid. This
is why I made you take this one. This is my number one pet peeve when it comes to live streaming video. And I don't want to go too deep into a rant on it. I think people have probably heard me rant on this one before. But if your camera can only output an interlaced signal, get rid of it. Get a different camera. Interlacing signals have no business in online video streaming. Unless you have a way of cleanly and high quality de-interlacing the signal, don't use it. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. And then finally, I'll just quickly mention these two, but definitely take into consider how much movement you have in your stream. A locked off camera requires a much lower bit rate than action sports will. So that's one consideration. And then finally, cables. And there's been so many times that I've had problems, and then lo and behold, it is in fact the cable. And there's a wide range of quality in the cables that you can purchase. I would always recommend to invest in the extra $10 and buy the good cable, and then have some backup cables as well, because they fail more often than you'd imagine. So always check your cables and double check your cables and your HDMI ports on your devices as well.
Yeah, exactly. So there's definitely a bunch of different things there to consider and look at. But yeah, again, it's double checking all these pieces, right, and verifying these different pieces. So let's move on to audio. Now, this is one I'll admit I'm not the most. I wouldn't say I'm the best expert in audio in terms of quality of audio. That's not my area of expertise. That's why I make sure I have other guys on my team that are. But in general, it's not much different from what we were talking about with video. All of this is really all about logical troubleshooting, chasing down that signal chain and making sure that we verify all the different points. So we get the question, bad audio. We need to identify and qualify what exactly is bad about it, and then we need to chase down where that problem originates. The first one's pretty obvious. No audio. If we're not getting any audio at all in our stream, again, we need to start back at the source. What is our source? For me, what I'm using today is a USB microphone plugged directly into my encoder. That's a very short chain for me to debug, right? And there's lights on the mic. If it wasn't getting power, there would be no lights. So that would be quick and easy. But if I'm using something like a mixer, a big soundboard, then we're into a whole world of possibilities that we need to consider. And that's where things get a little more complicated, I suppose. But that's the first place to start, because, again, it could be gain levels. It could be outputs not enabled. It could be, there's one mixer we have in the office where if you turn one switch into like its studio monitoring channel, and some of our audio guys love to turn that on when they're doing verification. But if they forget to turn that off, our program audio doesn't go out, so it doesn't get to the encoder. It's one little switch you might miss. So you definitely want to start there at the source. But of course, if you have a big mixer and a soundboard, chances are it has some sort of level indicator coming from your microphones, right? So do they have levels? We don't have to worry about the encoder if the soundboard's not even getting levels. So again, starting at the beginning. working your way back. One of the things that can happen is obviously, is it muted? And Dan, I know you're using a wireless lav, but it probably has a mute button on the pack, right?
Yeah, exactly. Very handy to have, an attenuator or a mute button. It can kind of save you if you have to cough, if you have to, go to the washroom or something. You don't want necessarily everybody hearing that, but just make sure that, if you do use your mute button, to turn it off when you're done.
And again, that's an obvious place to start, right? No audio. Hey, you're using a wireless lav. Is it muted? Maybe the batteries are dead. Double check that. I mean, some of this sounds kind of silly and almost stupid to not think about these, but the number of times that we've run across these exact scenarios, or admittedly done them ourselves, is pretty frequent. Of course, cables, another big one. XLR cables are beefy, they're high quality, they could still go bad, so check them. Make sure you have spares. And then, of course, depending on your signal chain, looking at device compatibility. So something like our Pearl Mini can accept a microphone or a line level signal, where the Pearl 2 can only accept a line level signal. If we try to send a mic level signal to it over XLR, it's not going to receive anything. So we need to check device compatibility on all the pieces in our chain to make sure that we have the right things in play. The other one, of course, is low audio, or the reverse, maybe too high audio. We were encountering that earlier with you, Dan. We need to verify the gain levels. Again, starting at the source, setting up for this today. Dan, what did you go through to kind of correct some of your audio, which we ended up correcting again, but originally you were a bit low.
Yeah, exactly. So my strategy with correcting audio was to actually kind of go against the grain, to monitor at the endpoint first, and our producer Adam was doing that for me. I do have a sensitivity adjustment right on the mic pack, but I also have some adjustability in the Pearl encoder. Pearl encoder is great because it actually has audio meters right on the front display, so I can get a very quick sense of if I'm peaking at all, or if what my loudness setting is. But the simple solution was to just reduce. I actually reduced the sensitivity on my mic pack itself, and then I added some gain in the encoder. I found that the peaking was being introduced by my microphone, and once I corrected that, it was all good.
Yeah, and the same thing could happen in the reverse with low audio, where maybe the mic pack sensitivity is way, way too low, and we need to make sure we bring it up. So we need to find that balance. And of course, for all the audio nerds out there, yeah, you do have to find a balance. Like Dan was saying, his mic pack was causing peaking, early on, and we had to bring that down. But that meant we had to bring up the gain on Pearl, and we went a little too hot once Dan started getting into his show voice, so we had to bring that back down a little bit once we got going. No big deal. Luckily, we can do that on the fly. But those are things to look out for. The other one is mono video. Again, double checking what the settings are on your audio sources, your encoders. If you're expecting stereo sound, make sure you're getting stereo across the chain. Make sure nothing is dropping it down to mono. I was watching a YouTube video the other day on my phone, just while I was working around in the kitchen cooking some things, and I put in my Bluetooth earbuds, but I only put one in because I wanted my other ear open to hear something else. The video they encoded was mono, so I didn't hear the entire spoken audio track. All I heard was the background music because they split it between the left and right channels. You don't want to do that. You want to make sure that things are going to be nice and even and not weird like that. It makes the viewing experience less desirable. So again, verifying those kind of things. Make sure you're not sending mono out there. Things are balanced across both left and right channels if you can. The other one, and this is a fairly common one depending on your setup, but video and audio being out of sync. This might be one of the hardest ones to dial in. It's very easy to diagnose. Anybody can diagnose when lip sync is out, right? That's easy to spot. Once it's over 100 milliseconds, it's pretty easy to spot. And it's very distracting for the viewer, so we don't want that. So it's easy to spot, and the solution is easy, but dialing it in gets a little more complicated. Typically, your encoder, Pearl definitely has this, and even software encoders can do this as well. It's going to involve adjusting your audio delay in your encoder settings somewhere. So with Pearl, there's an audio delay field on the audio inputs that we can adjust from minus to plus 300 milliseconds and anything in between. It's not uncommon to find that you have to set somewhere between 90 to 120 milliseconds if you have a lot of extra gear in front of your encoder and they're taking different paths between audio and video to get to your encoder. We've often even found that even some cameras, if we embed audio into the camera itself will break the sync and we need to make some adjustments. It might only be 20, 30, 60 milliseconds, but sometimes that's noticeable. So getting it precisely tuned, and I know, Dan, you went through this a lot in the past, getting it precisely tuned can be tricky and definitely requires a lot of testing. But what are some of the tools that we can use to figure out exactly what our offset should be?
Well, one of the simple tools that you can use is actually a video test monitor. So you set up an audio sync pattern on a monitor and you point your camera at it. And then you actually look at the waveform. You can do a recording and you can look at the waveform of the audio and see if it's in sync with your video. And it's very easy to find test patterns. If you just go on YouTube, you'll find them. The one thing I would mention with that is, of course, make sure that you're using a relatively low latency latency monitor if you're going to do that. If you're using something like a television set, you might have 30 milliseconds of delay. So use a quality computer monitor if you're going to record a test pattern. But that would be my recommendation, is to actually use a test pattern that you can easily find online, and then record your test pattern, bring it into, if you have an editing software like Adobe Premiere, you can bring it into your editing software and compare the waveform of those audio beats with the test pattern image. And that will give you a very clear idea of if your audio is early or if your audio is late. And many of the test patterns will even give you some idea of how early or how late your audio is.
Yeah, the ones that tell you the exact milliseconds if you catch the right frame really do help, because then you can go, all right, I know that it was that much off, and you can quickly enter those delay settings.
Yeah.
So again, it's a bit more of a precise science, but when you get it and you get it done well, but definitely requires quite a bit of advanced testing to really nail it.
Yeah,
and but once you get used to your gear, it's fine.
Yeah, and I should note, like, I've even seen cameras that actually have internal audio synchronization issues. Actually, I think the C100 that we've used has the audio's about 18 milliseconds late on that, and that's like a frame, right?
Yeah.
So good practice just to test your audio sync on your camera, regardless if that's your audio path, and understand if there might be any minor synchronization issues right at the source of your audio and video signal.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other one here would be, and this can be a big one. This can be a big one to unpack, and can, on my experience, sometimes can be the most annoying to troubleshoot. But actual signal stuff, so static, echo, crackling, interference, there could be a ton of things here. Obviously, echo could be a result of the environment. The room is just too bouncy. There's too much echo, literally just sound waves bouncing around. You might need to dampen the room, or you might need to get people to face a different direction to make sure that their voice is not projecting and bouncing. So check physical positions of things. Maybe get the microphone closer to the person speaking and reduce the gain if you can. Obviously, make sure the microphone's pointed in the right direction, which sounds silly, but I was watching a video the other day from a guy who does a lot of, kind of tips and tricks for game streamers. And he was talking, one of his pet peeves he sees all the time is people who have like Blue Yeti microphones or other similar USB microphones, and they're pointing in a way that the polar pattern of that cardioid mic doesn't even make sense. Because it looks cool the other way, but it's not doing its job properly. So make sure you understand the equipment, understand the pattern of the microphone, and use it appropriately to make sure that you're cutting down on any potential outside noise. Microphone quality, of course. I believe believe our producer said this when we were setting up some things. He's like, if anyone's using an Omni, they're dead to me, because that's kind of the way it works sometimes. If you're in a big open space and there's going to be people around, using an omnidirectional microphone is probably a really terrible idea. So, again, consider the equipment you're using in the space you're using it and how you're going to use it to minimize that. The other thing is interference. Now, this can be a big one because it's a weird one, but look at the surroundings and remove sources of interference, right? RF interference is pretty serious. It happens all the time. In one of our old studio setups in the office, one day someone moved an XLR cable for a shotgun microphone because they didn't like where it was laying along the floor. And they moved it just far enough that it started running close enough to a power bar. And just that slight difference in proximity to that power source meant we were getting massive interference on the signal. So you need to think about this environment and make sure that we minimize and distance some of these things. So there can be grounding issues when it comes to audio stuff. There can be obviously interference from outside other sources. So again, we just want to verify that things are as isolated as they can be. And if we're getting static and interference and stuff like that, very likely that's not happening at, say, the encoder or network or CDN stage. It's definitely happening at your source before the encoder stage somewhere, most likely. So again, starting there and working your way back to see if you can isolate that stuff. And sometimes it is as easy as just move that XLR cable a few inches in a certain direction. That might be all that you need. Though ground loop isolation stuff is a whole other thing, but that can happen too. And just maybe plug your soundboard into a different outlet that's on a different ground or if you're using an extension cord that doesn't have a ground, probably not a good idea. These kind of things could be kind of important. So, all right.
All good tips, George. Thanks.
Yeah.
So yeah, overall, I think like the big takeaways here for audio is, audio, it's a science, but it's also an art, and invest in good equipment, check, test, isolate any potential variables that you can in your audio path, and have backups as well. Always good to have a backup for whatever audio sources you're going to be using, and again, the mantra of test, test, test plays in big, especially with audio as well.
Yeah. Spare cables, spare batteries, all those good things.
So what do we have next? Let's get into CDN and streaming issues. I'm seeing a lot of questions in chat about those type of things. So let's dive right into the big kahuna of content delivery, streaming, networking, which plays in huge across any live streaming common problems.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, this is the one area that a lot of people encounter issues. Once people have been doing a bit of streaming or even video recording for a little while, they get pretty confident in the actual production gear in terms of cameras and audio, and they get to know that stuff pretty well. Once you have your kit and you know what you're using on a routine basis, those things don't tend to change very much, aside from consumables like cables. But when you get to things like networking and platforms, those are ever-changing variables. So we need to kind of look at those. So first one here is the stream won't start. I think someone did ask a question similar to this earlier on. There's a bunch of things we need to check when we look at a condition like the stream won't start. This is one of those very generic problems to report that could literally be almost anything. So again, even just from an encoder to our destination and network stack in between, we need to break it down into components. So we need to first check our network setup. Is that actually running properly? Do we actually have a network connection? Are we actually able to get out to the internet? Next, we definitely want to quickly check our stream key and URL for our platform. So something like Facebook or YouTube, those stream keys can change. So verify that you have the correct stream key set up. Your encoder might not always give you the feedback that it's invalid because it might be valid, just not for the event you're running right now. So verify that it is actually matched up. Of course, we've been saying all along, make sure you're verifying at the final destination and in the middle. So if you're verifying it on the CDN already, you're going to have a UI up with hopefully a confidence display there showing things. Some CDNs have a different workflow than others. So Facebook and YouTube, once you have a key, that key exists and you can basically use it whenever you want. It's a valid destination as soon as a key is generated. Some CDNs, like Microsoft Stream or even Crowdcast that we're using right now for that matter, and a few others, when you create an event and it gives you a key, it doesn't mean that that destination is open and ready to use until you actually start the event. So sometimes you have to start the platform first, then start your encoder, and then go live. So just understand the platform and which steps are necessary. I've taken a lot of calls from customers using Microsoft Stream when it first launched who ran into exactly this problem. They're like, my key is fine, I verified that. My network is fine, I verified that. And it was just a matter of workflow that, unlike many CDNs, they didn't understand that Microsoft Stream functioned in a way where you have to start it, then start your encoder. One we encounter all the time on public networks, and internally sometimes as well, is network security. You might have a firewall that's blocking the traffic, or worst case scenario, you might have an internet provider that is independent of your firewall blocking certain traffic. So we need to understand networking as well. That can be a big one, but it's important to at least know who to ask in terms of networking. And then lastly, bandwidth. If we just simply, the bandwidth is not there, the stream's not going to work very well. Luckily, that's an easy one to test. You can run speed tests on devices that are connected to the same network and verify you're getting some level of connectivity and what it might be. Test. So run it 5 times. See what the average is, not what the peak is. That kind of thing. Just to try and help narrow that down. Hopefully none of our viewers are experiencing any issues today, but just while we're thinking about it, is there anyone there who who is running into any issues on Crowdcast there today in chat, Dan?
Doesn't appear to. I haven't seen any issues, and I've been monitoring Crowdcast as well, and it's looked very stable, and haven't seen any issues.
Awesome. So again, if some of you were reporting in chat that you were getting buffering or choppiness or something like that, we would want to take into consideration, where that experience is happening. It could be your local bandwidth. So we would then look at, okay, if we have 100 viewers, how many of them are actually encountering this and how many are not, and trying to figure out where that fall down might be. If everyone is having that and we are also having it in our confidence platform dashboard, we know it's our hosting a bandwidth that's the problem. Us from our encoder to the platform that's the problem. So again, we need to understand where to gather the information to understand where that issue is. So,
and George, I've got a bit of a question there.
Sure.
Different CDNs. With YouTube, for example, I could stream 4K to YouTube if I wanted to, right? And then YouTube will serve, re-encodes at various bit rates to viewers who maybe don't have enough bandwidth to view a 4K stream, for example. Yeah. Is that sort of encoding, re-encoding and at lower bit rates, is that common of most CDNs and most platforms? Or is there cases where a CDN may only pass through your encoding and you may want to in fact lower that so that you can reach a wider audience?
Yes. So it's what's known as transcoding, and not all CDNs provide it by default. Sometimes that's what they will build into a tiered pricing plan. So your basic plan might not include transcoding, where you might have to buy a more expensive package in order to include transcoding. And exactly that, if you know that your viewers are extremely wide-ranging in their capabilities and their bandwidth needs, you need to make sure that your CDN is doing transcoding at some level. YouTube and Facebook are very good at it because as social networks, they know that their viewer and user base is a huge spectrum. And so they want to make sure that they can do that. So it's there by default, even though both Facebook and YouTube are free to use for streaming. They include it. Many others either, we were talking about Vimeo earlier, right? Vimeo, very cool platform, has some awesome features. It'll do transcoding on your live streams, but that comes at a price. Wowza is another one. Our friends over at Wowza, some of you, if you've seen some of our earlier webinars, we had Tim from Wowza join us. Wowza is an awesome platform, more affordable, but transcoding is not built in unless you option that. So they can do it, absolutely, but it's an option. So you have to make sure you're choosing that option explicitly. So you do need to know your audience and kind of pay attention to what you might be doing. And if it looks like you're going to need that, then make sure that you have it. My rule of thumb is always have transcoding available. That's my general rule, because it's just going to save your butt. Honestly, the reality is that bandwidth is a huge variable. It's peaks and valleys. I don't care how much money you're paying for your connection. I don't care what the ISP marketed to you and sold you on. You are not getting 100% all the time. You're just not. And it's going to vary. And so we need to work within those limits. And that's true of everybody. So even though I might be able to, stream successfully 4K one day, doesn't mean it's going to work great the next day. So making sure that we have that, ability to flex to whatever changing variables there might be is pretty important. But like you said, Dan, some of the things we can do there is we can lower the encoding settings. And there's a few things that go hand in hand there. If for some reason, God forbid, you're using Wi-Fi, switch to a hardwired connection. Don't use Wi-Fi for streaming. It's a terrible idea. Use a hardwired connection. It's going to be more stable, less prone to interference, and is going to be a better overall experience. Check with your internet provider to understand their limitations. I have encountered this several times with more public venues like conference centers, hotels, places like that, where the internet providers that provide connectivity to rentals, someone using the hotel ballroom, you're not going to use the hotel's own internet connection. They're not going to let you do that. They're very likely bringing in a separate connection from another ISP, or maybe the same one, but a dedicated connection for that. If you want it to work well, they will. But some of those internet providers, for whatever reason, don't like live streaming and could potentially be blocking your stream traffic. So we need to, again, through troubleshooting, understand where the breakdown point is and then target that and go after that. And if they have a limitation, make sure that they get rid of it. Mm-hmm. The other one, as we mentioned much earlier, might be frame drops at the encoder level. So the first place there is, what's our system load at? And are we actually encoding the full frame rate that we're anticipating? So I think that kind of covers that section. This is a funny one. We've done it ourselves, and I've seen a number of customers run into this as well. Hopefully you never run into this, but it is definitely something that could happen. And that is the stream is displaying different content than what you think you're sending or what you want to be sending. Here's where persistent stream keys, as handy as they are actually a risk. The most common reason we see this mix up across wires, basically, is reusing the stream key in multiple encoders. Two different encoders, you're trying to use the same key. Whoever starts second is going to be the one who took over. So you need to make sure that if you are using persistent stream keys, you're very careful not to leak them and not to share them too much. And as we mentioned earlier, verify those keys, even if it's persistent. Verify it during your setup procedure.
Yeah.
And if it does look like a duplication, generate a new one. It's not hard to do in most platforms, but check those devices. Um, if you end up leaking your stream key, change it right away because it will mean people could potentially take over your stream depending on the platform you're using. So, especially if it's social media like Facebook or YouTube, if someone gets a hold of your stream key, that's all they need to take over streaming on your channel. So be cautious with it. Finally, we
Awesome.
mentioned this a couple times, Dan. Testing bandwidth.
Yeah, bandwidth. It's always it's always a variable, as we mentioned. So, run some speed tests. Run them at different times of day as well on your system. Sometimes you might run your test in the morning, and then there's way more traffic in the afternoon. And also just kind of be aware of the infrastructure of your network. If it's at a hotel, there's going to be peak hours where that hotel's internet infrastructure is more stressed than other times of day. So, as far as your testing infrastructure, you should test at whatever time of day you plan to go live. That is the closest to a real world test that you can perform. And even test it using different devices, to see if there's any variation there. And obviously you're looking for not only what kind of bandwidth, but what consistency of bandwidth you're getting as well.
Exactly. My best rule of thumb also is, again, when I was talking negatively about Wi-Fi, this is another place where Wi-Fi is also not going to give you a fair, accurate measurement of what your true bandwidth is. Because if you're testing it on a device that's connecting to the larger network over Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi itself could be bottlenecking your test. So you want to make sure you're getting as close to the source as possible. And if that means that if you have the ability to plug Ethernet directly into your router, do that. That's going to be your fairest test. General guidelines, what we've always said is, and it depends on which way around you want to look at it. The math is the same, just depends on how you want to talk about the equation. But if you want to stream in full HD, an average bit rate there is about 5 megabit, just as a general rule of thumb. And an average, that means we probably want at least 8 plus, maybe as much as 10 megabit upload speed. Download is irrelevant. We're sending something out. So upload speed is what matters. If we can't achieve 8 plus, 10 plus, then we might need to look at changing our encoding down to 720, where we can then reduce our bit rate and maintain a similar image quality, and get away with it on a lower bandwidth connection. So these are kind of the general things we want to check on.
Yeah, and Hillary is just confirming this is, of course, upload bandwidth. That's going to be your most important factor. Download isn't going to play into your stream so much, but download might be important for other things that you're doing with your stream. If you're playing back media, or if you're, using any internet sources in your content, that's where your download might play into.
Or trying to bring in a remote guest like we're doing right now. Both Dan and I are technically remote guests into our studio. If our download speed at our studio was terrible right now, both Dan and I wouldn't be able to come in as easily or as cleanly. So again, we have to think about what else we're doing. But from a very basic standpoint, yes, they're absolutely right. We are talking about upload, which, depending on where you live, your internet providers don't like to advertise upload speeds unless you read the fine print, because they're typically not synchronous with the download. They're usually much, much, much lower than the download speed. So common marketing, and we should all know this as consumers, marketing is always going to advertise you a best case scenario, right? That's what marketing is all about. So when you go to buy an internet package, if they say that you have 150 meg, chances are that's only the download speed, and your upload might only be 5, 10, maybe 15. So we need to check, we need to verify. And you also don't count on what their marketing says, even if they do tell you what the upload is. Test it anyways. Like, Dan, I think your connection, you're one of the lucky ones. You're rated to have like gigabit in your house, but do you ever actually achieve full gigabit?
Pretty close. I mean, you can get up in testing. You can get up into the 900 up and down. So with fiber, there's very solid consistency. You don't quite get exactly gigabit, but I mean some of that could be, the infrastructure that I have here in my house. Of course, I've got a modem and a router, and I've got some wiring in my building as well. But Hillary's actually asking, what are the best ways to test? What are the best testing methodologies? For me, I usually use speedtest.net, or if you just go onto Google, has its own speed test actually, and all you have to do is type in speed test into Google, and it pops up right in the search results, and you can do it right from there. I don't know if you have any other recommendations, George.
I actually like to use both because they sometimes will give you slightly different measurements because they bounce off of different servers. So for me, I usually use the Google one first because it's so easy to just search speed test. Usually it's 2 words, not 1 word. And it'll pop up, like you say, in the search results. If I was a little uncomfortable with the results I got, I might try speedtest.net as well, just to see if it's reporting something similar.
Speedtest.net is nice because you can choose which server location you want to be testing from. So you can choose a local one, but you could also try using a test location that's further away from your location as well.
Yeah, I would say the only one I don't like to use, and I have honestly never used for any real world application, is the speed test tools recommended by my internet provider. I'm sorry, I just simply don't trust it. What they're expecting me to bounce off of one of their servers very locally. That's not going to give me a fair representation of a full chain necessarily. The internet is a series of pipes and switches and so many points of failure in the internet itself. So using a neutral third party or multiple neutral third parties like the Google or speedtest.net tests are, I would say, the quickest and fairest ways to do that as a verification.
Awesome. Okay, so should we move on? What are we talking about next here, George?
Yeah. Well, I think we covered the best practices there. Hardwired instead of Wi-Fi. Make sure you record locally if you can, just in case. If anything goes terribly wrong and sideways, if you have a local record for a backup, you can always post it later. If you can, if you have full control over the network, try to set up a dedicated network or a dedicated subnet with dedicated bandwidth carved out for your streams so that if it is a shared network, no one invades that bandwidth space. That's a good rule of thumb. Minimize the number of devices that are using that same network or subnet if you can. Again, they're all going to be sharing this bandwidth to some degree, so the less sharing, the more consistent we're going to be and the better off we're going to be. We did this very early on in our studio in the office because some of our early tests, if you remember, Dan, especially some of our early 4K streaming tests, happened to coincide with our engineering team doing some massive upload of files, and everything fell apart. And it's simply because it's on a shared network where someone else just doing their job, doing what they do, wasn't aware what we were also trying to do, and that brought it all down. Mm-hmm. So again, if you can dedicate bandwidth, a dedicate connection, or carve it out from your network, that's going to be a good best practice.
And if you can't dedicate it, there's also some settings, and a lot of the higher end routers will have quality of service settings in the router menus, and you can prioritize certain types of traffic. For example, RTMP or certain ports on your network as well. So, get familiar with your router settings, and it's possible to optimize your connectivity there.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to jump into maybe some things a little bit more specific in terms of troubleshooting streaming issues on Perl systems exactly. So we're running a little long, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly here. Some of you who are not familiar with the Perl hardware encoders we make here and sell here at Epiphan, we currently have 2 models, the Perl 2 and the Perl Mini, and we also have the Perl Nano upcoming shortly, but primarily I'm going to talk about these 2. The idea with the Perl family is to be standalone, all-in-one production systems. So instead of having a whole rack of a switcher, a recorder, a streamer, a splitter, a scaler, condense that all down into one dedicated piece of hardware that's going to do all of those things at the same time. This can reduce your points of failure and help troubleshooting immensely. Not only that, but it eliminates the need for your computer or software on that computer being the problem, because we're now working with a dedicated box. So we don't have to worry about a Windows update in the middle of our event or something crashing in Windows or whatever the case may be. Or I saw a streamer the other day who was, streaming some content that was on the desktop of their computer, and they were getting text messages popping in. People could see the phone numbers of who was sending the messages. Don't do that. You're going to solve these problems by having dedicated pieces, and dedicated and hardware encoders is a great place to start. Troubleshooting on Perl, again, it can be fairly simple, and honestly, relating back to everything we've already talked about, the same rules apply, right? So I'm going to run through these. They're all number one, which is great because honestly, I couldn't rank these. But basically, it runs like this. When I get a call and someone says something like bad video, right, as we mentioned this at the beginning, I'm going to run through a number of different things. And this is basically what I'm going to run through. Very first thing I'm going to start with on a Perl is checking the system load. How many channels, which are separate encoders on a Perl, how many channels do they have configured? If it's a Perl Mini and they have more than 2 or 3 channels that are already configured, I already know what the problem is, to be honest. They're overloading the box. They need to scale back what they're doing. We need to fine tune the configuration. Assuming that the system load isn't too high, it looks like it should be running fine, then we can look at the encoding settings. Again, going to those basics: resolution, frame rate, bit rate, keyframe interval. Looking at those encoding settings, making sure they're valid for what we're trying to do. Then we want to check the streaming settings, how we're getting out to that destination. Is the URL and stream key correct? Is it valid? Is going where we want it to go? And then we might want to check some other pieces as well. The Perls, because they can do switching and they can do custom layouts, we need to sometimes look at those layouts and make sure that we're not doing anything weird with cropping and scaling. Do all the frames make sense? Does everything line up properly? Does our chroma keying on Perl 2 look good, or is that what's making it blocky and weird because we have a bad key? Checking those layouts can be pretty important. And then finally, we might want to check network stuff. Is there a firewall blocking anything? Can we even reach the internet? And sometimes we play with network settings that maybe we shouldn't, and we make some mistakes, and so we need to check those as well. These ones can be a little harder to chase down sometimes, but sometimes they can be very easy. But we need to look at those. Once all the others look like they're running as we expect, then we can get into networking. Perls luckily do have a bunch of health monitoring things built into it. The front touchscreen and lights on the front of Perl Mini will give you a very, very quick at-a-glance indicator. Right now I can look at my Perl Mini if I look down to the side here, and my stream sending SRT to the studio, that stream light is solid. It's good. If it was blinking, I would be able to see from the other side of the room that I'm getting an error on the stream and I need to investigate. So I could go in and I could figure out what's going on. Perl's going to tell us error codes, give us status on the main administrative panel, get us some information as to what's going on. Those messages can translate to a bunch of things, timeouts, all kinds of things, depending on what the problem is. But that's going to help our troubleshooting process start. Epiphan Cloud, which currently called AV Studio, soon to be Epiphan Cloud, is going to give some central monitoring options if you're not local to the Perl as well. So if you're running it remotely, the way our producer is right now, he would be able to see it remotely in his dashboard of Epiphan Cloud, some of these flags that are popping up. We're also going to be building in some more advanced network diagnostics into Perl itself to make this even easier. So it's going to give you quick verifications, just like check marks. Hey, do you have network? Do I have DNS? Do I have these kind of things to help speed up that network troubleshooting, which is mostly going to be beneficial when you're in an unknown, uncommon network that you might be using, like a hotel. So those are some of the quick ones. Maybe we'll dive into some of the questions. The last thing I was going to mention there on networking, if I'm stepping back just a minute here, one of the things I encounter all the time, far more frequently than I wish I did, is again just small mistakes being made at a network configuration level. Firewall, that's complicated, but simple things can be mistakes as well. Sometimes we might feel like we need to set a static IP address on our encoding device or on our computer for some reason. If we do, we need to fully understand the impact of all the other things that come with it, like a subnet mask, a gateway, and a DNS server. And what I've encountered many, many times is people setting a static IP address and either an incorrect subnet mask to go with it, or just not including a gateway or DNS at all. If we don't have a gateway or we don't have a DNS, we're not going to reach the internet, basically. Without a gateway, it won't know how to get out past your router firewall to the internet. Without DNS, we can't resolve a name like youtube.com. There's no reference to know what that address is. So we have to have, if we're doing static IP addresses, we must have all kind of 4 columns checked and valid, real. An IP address, a subnet mask, a gateway, and a DNS server. Luckily, DNS is really easy. You can always use Google's DNS, which is just 8.8.8.8. It's an easy one to remember. That's your fallback. So, all right, enough on that. Let's dive into some questions here, Dan. What do we
have lots of questions and comments that have come in throughout the session. So
all right.
Let's dive right in. I think a few of them are hinting at the same things. One of the top upvoted questions right off the top is the persistent stream key with YouTube.
Right.
This is from Alex. He's saying he used to be able to use Perl 2 for a quick single button live stream, and he would stream to YouTube every week using that same persistent stream key. And I also saw a question related to Webcaster X2 that I think might be to do with the same thing, and that is the Stream Now functionality of YouTube. So maybe you can touch on that and the changes that YouTube made and why the persistent stream key and Stream Now function.
Yeah, those two are absolutely related. They are exactly the same problem. YouTube has discontinued the old Classic Studio interface. One of the great easy parts of the old Classic Studio was a feature called Stream Now, which was essentially you didn't have to create an event, you didn't have to pre-configure anything, and a stream key for Stream Now would not change unless you told it to change, which means it was persistent, the way Alex was mentioning. Stream Now no longer exists. YouTube made this decision. I mean, I guess you can call the CEO of Google and complain if you want, but it doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. So the only way to do things on YouTube now is to essentially create events, whether that's something that's going to happen right now or whether that's something you're going to schedule for a future date. The process is basically the same, but you have to go into the new studio. You have to create that stream. It's going to give you a key, which there are some ways of doing persistent still, and I'll kind of talk about those in a second. But you have to create it. Unfortunately, you can't just push start and it go to Stream Now anymore. That function no longer exists within the YouTube ecosystem. For Alex using a Perl 2 and wanting to do it persistent, what you can do is you can still define a encoder profile in YouTube so that every time you do create an event, you can select that encoder and it will always use the same key. So you could leave Perl alone and just make sure you would create your events with that custom encoder profile. And when you create it, select that, and then it won't be unique every time. It will be persistent, but you do have to go through the steps regardless. For Webcaster X2, essentially, the main thing you have to look at there is again, you have to create it. But once it's created, it will show up in the stream destination field in the preferences menu of your Webcaster X2. Webcaster will always default to the Stream Now, but of course that doesn't go anywhere now, so we have to change it. What it does mean is that unfortunately you do have to set up Webcaster with a display. It doesn't have to be a big display, it could be a small field monitor and a USB mouse so that you can change the stream destination for going to YouTube. Again, like I said, this is something changed outside of our control, sadly. It's just something YouTube's doing.
Well, thanks for that. And, it's sometimes tough to keep up with the platforms because it seems like they're changing all the time, especially the big ones like YouTube and Facebook. But I hope that at least answers your question, and Sam and Alex, and a little more work probably on the front end to get your stream set up, but pairing your encoder might be a good option to simplify that workflow a little bit. Another question here. This is from Hillary. Any recommendations about what kind of network switch you're going to need to properly do NDI?
I mean, you can do NDI over basically anything that's gigabit. But if this is going to be a network switch that's going to be the backbone of a bigger infrastructure, then I would just get the fastest possible thing you can. If that's 2.5 gig or 10 gig, more the better, basically, to avoid collisions as best you can. But anything that's at least gigabit, you should be fine as long as you don't have too much NDI going on. If you're using a lot of, and again, think about NDI as two different things. There's regular NDI and NDI HX. If you have a whole bunch of regular NDI on the same network and it's not a dedicated network, you're going to saturate it pretty quickly. So consider that. HX being much lower bandwidth requirements, you can get away with more of it. So it's going to depend a little bit, but anything that's at least gigabit, you should be able to do most things. But whatever the fastest you can do within your budget, that's what you need to do.
Thanks, George. Let's try to rapid fire through a few more here. I'm seeing interesting poll results coming in. It seems that, by and large, the component of live streaming that seems to give people the most trouble is on the CDN and the streaming side, followed by bandwidth. So,
not surprised.
And when we hear people having problems with YouTube, it's not entirely surprising.
No.
But we did get a comment that came in. Let me just find it here. I hope I say this correctly. Guarev had asked us to please suggest one best CDN video service like Vimeo, where we can make live streaming up to 2,000 plus concurrent viewers. So, I guess the question here is, what kind of CDN recommendations can we make?
So, Dan, you and I have talked about this, long time ago on previous Live at Epiphan shows. Live at Epiphan every Thursday, 3 o'clock Eastern. Shameless plug. Where basically the platform choice is where your audience is. If you're targeting an audience the best example I can think of quickly is, let's say you're a church and you're trying to stream, especially these days, because you can't have that many people in the church. So you're trying to stream to everyone. Chances are your community exists already in social media to some degree, like Facebook, or they're used to coming to your website. So you need to identify where your audience lives online. If your online community is made up on social media like Facebook or YouTube, stream on Facebook or YouTube, or both. If they don't, if that's not really part of your community, let's say you're a business and you're talking about 2,000 employees globally, then you probably don't want to be on social media. You probably want to be on something a little more private, a little more securable, and you might want to look at something like Wowza or Vimeo or Streamshark, companies like that. Now, those are going to cost. They're going to have a price to them. They're not going to be free. So you also need to look at your budgeting. If you have no budget to pay for a platform, I would say YouTube. Unless, again, it's a community-driven thing and that community lives on Facebook already, then Facebook. Mm. YouTube is more flexible than Facebook is in terms of how you can deliver content. It supports higher resolutions, higher bit rates. It does better transcoding, in my opinion. It has better tools. You can embed it easier. There's all kinds of things that you can do with YouTube. And people are used to consuming video on YouTube on a daily basis, so the interface is familiar. But again, you have to think about your content and who your audience is and where they live online.
That's a good point, George. I would just, to sort of play devil's advocate a little bit, I think, in some cases, if you're a church or a business, your audience exists in your community in some way, shape, or form. So you might have the ability to send your audience wherever is most convenient for you as well.
For sure.
So, for example, if you're a church or house of worship who has a website already, embedding your video on your own website, I think could be, far superior to using a public platform like Facebook or YouTube, because you can really control that environment and, keep your audience within your ecosystem rather than sending them out to, a platform where they may have other distractions in place. So just some thoughts
absolutely.
there. But
yeah, and I guess my point is, again, look at where they currently interact with you on a community level, and make it easy for them.
Sure.
No one's going to go out of their way, right? I mean, if you already have a huge interactive community on social media and you stream there, those people are going to get notifications automatically, right? So there's important things to look at that way. But yes, there is no one answer to this.
Yeah. So quick summary, Gaurav, for your question is, we might recommend that you take a look at a service like Vimeo, or if you want to try to be a little bit more cost effective, maybe check out Wowza. Wowza's got some great capabilities, and if you're looking for 2,000 plus concurrent viewers, either of those platforms can handle that.
Right.
Let's dive into some more. We've got lots of questions and comments here, so maybe we'll try to get through as many as we can as quickly as we can. Another question about the YouTube stream now. I think we've covered that. Someone's asking, Rob here is asking, once you get above the minimum needed to stream, does a faster internet connection actually make any difference to the stability or quality of your stream based on using the same equipment?
Yes and no. First, you have to define what minimum is for you. Again, as I was mentioning, bandwidth always does this. So if you are just barely making the minimum, then a faster connection is going to make you more survivable during some of those valleys, right? Where you might not encounter any glitching if you do happen to hit a really, really low point in bandwidth. But in general, no, I mean, if you're trying to stream 1080 at 5 megabit and you have a 100 meg upload, no, going faster is not going to help you at all. So within reason. But again, our general rule of thumb is try to make sure that you have at least 1.5 or times 2 bandwidth of your bit rate. So if it's 5 megabit, make sure you have at least 10 upload. If it's a dedicated network, if it's shared, that's where going faster is going to help you more and more and more.
Okay, another question here from Hillary. She had been asking about trying to use video playback as a source, and using a second computer with something like a Pearl 2 to play back some video content. Having the issue of having the menu bar and the mouse and the cursor. What are some possible solutions to that? I would just jump in right away and actually suggest that maybe it might be worth looking into some professional playback software if this is something you're doing on a regular basis. One that has come to mind is QLab. I know that that's recommended by a lot of AV professionals. I think it only runs on Mac, however. But George, you might have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, you could also look at at titling software if you want, in a way. If it's really, really short clips, we sometimes will queue those up into titling software like NewBlueFX. And that way we can send it into our Pearl 2 using NDI, including alpha channel if we need transparencies and stuff like that. And when we hit that, it basically functions like a title. So when we trigger that title, it plays the clip. So that's one way you can do it. Another way to do it would be you could embed it into a PowerPoint slide and set up the PowerPoint slide to play the clip as soon as you change that slide. And that way you shouldn't see playback stuff, right? Lastly, you could basically use a large resolution and then just crop out the menus, right? So don't put the video full screen, kind of make it more in the center, and then just crop out all the menus around it so that no one sees that. They only see the video playback. That's another way to do it. I do see Hillary kind of correcting in chat there. Sorry, not playback, but think OBS in terms of graphics and overlays and features. Yeah, so it depends on what you want for overlays and things like that, Hillary. Again, my recommendation in terms of titles, you can definitely do it with OBS or pretty much anything that'll output a video signal that you can key out a background or whatever. But if you use something like New Blue FX, where you could do it over NDI with Alpha Channel, it makes it a little easier.
Super. Thanks for that, George. Just looking here. Someone's having trouble streaming to their Facebook group. I know that there's some differences between streaming to your profile versus streaming to your group versus streaming to your page.
Oh, yeah.
My understanding is that the most reliable way to live stream on Facebook is with a page rather than a group. Maybe we can just cover this very quickly, George.
Yeah, so I see that question here as well from Frank. Frank, it's a permissions issue. You don't have permission to stream in the group. It's that simple. Whoever's the administrator of the group needs to enable the streaming permission as a per user basis. This is a change that Facebook made about 1.5 to 2 years ago when they were really under the gun about privacy. And one of the first things they did to counter those kind of, people bringing up privacy issues was to lock down streaming and how you did streaming very, very quickly. And the first one was events couldn't really do it at all. And then groups had to be a permission-based system instead of anybody being able to stream on any group they're a member of. You had to explicitly grant permission. So typically, based on your description there, Frank, I'm going to say it's a permissions thing. So just check out, if you're not the administrator of the group, you'll have to ask the administrator. If you are, you'll have to go into the administrative settings of the group and make sure that live streaming permissions is granted.
Super. Sharif had a question. Again, this is a lot of CDN questions. YouTube, he's getting a message every now and then that cannot retrieve YouTube account. I'm assuming this is with his Webcaster X2. And after that, he can't get streaming in the channel again. What's the...
I don't have a good answer for that right now, Sharif. If you could send us an email just to info@epiphan.com, our support team can help you. Please provide as much detail as you can. I need a little more to go on than that. But if you're starting to lose access to a YouTube account and you have to make a new one, my first reaction is your accounts might be getting banned because you're streaming content that's getting flagged for copyright. So I would reach out to us with more info. We'll see what we can do to help.
Awesome. Thanks, George. Rob was asking about graphics cards in your computer. So for example, does it make a difference to have a better graphics card in your computer? For example, a standard iMac has a Radeon R9 in it. It's a 2 gig card. Mm-hmm. Does upgrading your graphics card provide any advantages? Maybe if you're doing hardware encoding using software.
Yeah. Yes, it can, definitely. As newer graphics card generations come out, as newer GPUs come out, they are adding more and more hardware codecs into the GPU, NVIDIA especially.
They have NVENC, right? Which is like a pretty high quality encode from what I've seen.
Good. It's extremely good. So if you have a computer, and AMD has their own as well, it's not as good, but especially the older 380 generation R9s, the newer stuff's a bit better. But that basically, yes, it can, depending on the generation of card you have. It's not all about pure out and out speed. It's also going to depend on what else you're doing with the system. Yeah. Now, the fact that you said you're using an iMac, chances are you're probably not game streaming, Rob, but if you were, and that's the GPU you had, and you were trying to game and stream on the same system and leverage the GPU as a hardware encoder, that card definitely not going to cut it. And if you could upgrade it, it would make a world of difference. But if we're talking about just running OBS and some capture cards and doing some streaming and we want to leverage the GPU, if the software you're using can leverage the GPU hardware, it's not going to make a massive difference to leaps and bounds forward. But it could, depending on the generation you have now compared to what's out there now.
Awesome. I think that's a good answer, George. Thanks. We had another question here. This is from Hillary. We were talking about audio sync before. If your audio sync is changing or drifting over time, this is something that she experienced in OBS. What kind of a problem are you looking at with that?
That's a tough honestly, that's one of the hardest ones to troubleshoot. I'm not going to lie. Drifting sync is really hard to narrow down. Um, it I've seen it be system load where the computer's just not keeping up with what's going on, and that causes it to drift. It could be inherent to the devices you're using to bring those signals into the computer. That's a really, really hard one to troubleshoot, to be honest. There could be any number of possibilities there. So I don't think I have a good, clear answer.
Check your
for you,
sources
Hillary,
first.
but yeah, I mean that's one of the hardest things to nail down for sure.
Yeah. Okay, super. A few more that we can fire through here. I mean, there's more questions about YouTube, but I think we've covered
Yeah, I see
a
that
lot
one
of
here
similar
from
questions.
Sam, and that is exactly the issue we mentioned already before, where Stream Now no longer exists. Sam, if you missed the earlier stuff, basically Stream Now is no longer an option. You have to create events every time and select them.
Question here from Etienne. Etienne is asking, can you give some more feedback about why not to use interlaced video? Why not to use interlaced video, for example, 1080i?
If I remember from chat earlier, he was in the Netherlands. Yes, because interlacing doesn't compress well. It looks awful when it compresses. It looks like someone dragged a comb across the screen every time your camera moves position. It's awful. And this is common question coming from European customers, because for the longest time, and even still today to some degree, interlacing is the de facto European standard for television broadcast. Television broadcast and internet live streaming are not the same thing. They do not use the same standards. They're completely different. And what the internet expects is progressive signals. It expects it to be 1080p 30 or 720p 60. Interlaced signals that you would see on many European cameras might be 1080i 50. So first of all, you have to assume that you're basically cutting your usable resolution in half. Not ideal. It's going to look bad when it compresses, and you're also losing frame rates, because interlacing frame rates, if it's 1080i 50, is cut in half. Your real resulting is going to be 25. It's just not great. It looks bad. Every time I come across a YouTube video that has obviously been shot on an interlaced camera and not de-interlaced properly, it is so noticeable right away. I turn it off immediately. It literally is just disgusting. I can't say it any nicer than that. It's gross. It just doesn't look good. It's not the way to do things if you're looking for a high quality stream.
Okay, thanks for that, George.
Basically my rant all over again.
We have another question here from Andy. Andy's asking, what are our thoughts on mobile uploading via cell towers? For example, he's using a LiveView Solo. So I know that we have a variety of experience with exactly that with many people within Epiphan. So maybe you can talk a little bit about using like a mobile hotspot or cell phone towers to do your live streaming.
Yeah, I mean, the first question back is how much money you got, because the reality is a single cellular connection is a gamble every time. There is so much risk of interference. There is so much risk of downtime. You're subject to all kinds of conditions, brick walls, metal roofs, all kinds of things can mess with weather. Yeah. Congestion on the cell tower. All of these things play a factor. So the absolute best case scenario for streaming with cell signal is to use some form of cellular bonding to try to use multiple connections at the same time. And that's where I come in with how much money you got. Because if you want to go into bonding, it's going to cost you. It's totally possible. There's lots of options out there, but it's not going to be cheap. You're going to be spending money to do it. So again, if that's a critical part of your production infrastructure, it's probably worth spending the money. From what I recall, I believe the LiveViews did have some element of cellular bonding. It has to run through their service to do it, I believe. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just doing that from memory. And so it does have some decent options for cellular bonding, but there are other options out there as well with basically routers that will give you cellular bonding. What we do is we use a Netgear hotspot mobile router that has Ethernet on it, so we can connect our encoder over Ethernet to like a Pearl, for example, directly to that modem. It's not doing bonding, it's only a single cellular connection, but at least we know from our encoder to that modem, solid, gigabit. And then what we do on that modem is it also has plugs for external antennas. So we can plug those in, hopefully position them into the absolute best possible physical position to get the strongest signal we can. And it'll be much, much stronger than the signal on your phone or on the modem alone. Again, trying to generate the best possible scenario we can for signal strength, because that's everything. Just because your phone says it's getting 4G doesn't mean you're getting 4G speeds. If you're not getting full bars, basically, you're not getting your full speeds. So you need to pay again speed tests, test, hammer the speed tests, and that's a big place where look at the average of what you're getting, because it's going to vary a lot.
Awesome. So long story short, cell very unpredictable unless you want to spend a lot of money.
In theory, 5G is going to help this stuff, but we'll see.
Okay. A couple more questions here. This is from, well, here's one from Thomas. Thomas is asking, can you give a quick rundown of the hardware and layout settings that we're using here today? So I could take a stab at that. I mean, I think our setup is pretty unique in that we have a studio where we have some Pearl equipment located, and we're actually sending our feeds, our camera feeds, to that studio where Adam is doing the switching and layouts. And to do that, both George and I have, I think I can show it here. I don't want to disconnect myself, but I've got a Pearl Mini sitting right on my desk. So I can send a very reliable SRT stream to a studio in another location where the switching is being done. And I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, George, but the layouts are pretty straightforward here. We've got a motion background that's playing on a separate system, and then we've just got 2 camera crops and an input source for the presentation as well. So it's pretty straightforward with Pearl to be able to do what we're doing here today.
Yeah, exactly. I was just trying to go through the Q&A panel here as well. Let's see.
There was one from Alex here. I don't know if we've covered this, but in order to save each video source into a file for post-editing, instead of creating a dedicated channel for video source, is there another way to have the recorder do multi-track videos or record individual video sources and combine them into a switched live stream channel?
So on Pearl 2, in the context of a Pearl, a channel is an encoder. So there has to be a channel for that ISO if that's what you're looking for. On Pearl 2, this is fairly straightforward. A single Pearl 2 can create 6 separate encoding channels that are doing their own thing. So if you had, let's say, 5 inputs, you could easily have 5 channels that are just ISOs of each input and a 6th channel that's your production mixed and switched environment. And then you could either record all those ISOs by themselves, or in Pearl 2, you could also create a multi-track recorder as well and just have all 5 of those dump into a single multi-track file. Either way works. So it kind of depends. That's harder to do on a Pearl Mini because it just doesn't have the same level of power. But you could do something similar. You might have one channel that's mixed and switched and one channel that's an ISO. But if you have, let's say, 2 inputs on a Mini, you might have to choose which one's getting sacrificed as an ISO. Usually it's the slides because you can get those later. That's kind of my quick rundown.
Awesome. Another question here. Here's just a very quick question from Saul. With Epiphan's experience building USB capture devices, would we ever consider making an audio-only USB interface with XLR that has mic and line inputs, and then with the caveat being that it has the ability to adjust audio delay?
Great question, Saul. Luckily, that's an easy softball one. The answer is no. Essentially, there are so many good, high quality XLR USB interfaces on the market. And if you're bringing it into a computer, any decent encoding software has delay settings on it already. There's no space in the market for a device like that, really. It doesn't, it honestly just wouldn't make sense for us to do that. Our expertise is in video anyways, but in general, if you're looking for a really good, high quality device like that, look at something like a Focusrite Scarlett or something similar. They're absolutely awesome. And there's so many similar things on the market it's too crowded to consider to be a new entry, to be honest.
Question just came in here from Renee. Renee's asking, can we use Pearl Mini as a producer with Microsoft Teams?
One of my favorite questions. We did an episode a little bit on Teams and NDI last week, but Teams is a funny one because Teams has become an umbrella term that covers a few different features within the Teams family, right? There are Teams meetings, just like Zoom, WebEx, so on. There are Teams live events, which is basically it functioning as a Microsoft Stream server, CDN. So first, define which one you mean, which one you want. If it's the former, Microsoft Meetings, then no, not directly. If it's creating a Microsoft Teams live event that does not involve a meeting at all, then Teams does support ingesting a third-party encoder, which could be a Perl. So yes and no, depending on exactly what you're trying to accomplish. If, again, it's the meetings context, there are some ways to have things bridge in between. It's not exactly clean. It's not really a direct integration, but there are some ways to do it. So if you're interested in kind of diving into that deeper, send us an email to info@epiphan.com describing exactly the workflow you're going for, and we can try and help you out with that.
Thanks, George. Great. I think we've covered most of the questions. If you do have any other questions, please fire them into the Ask a Question tab right away, because we'll be happy to take a stab at them. Do we want to try to take Jeffrey's question from the beginning?
Yes.
Do we want to try to take a very quick stab? I know this is a deep question, but HDCP. Maybe we can just say, what is HDCP, and what workarounds might there be to solve that?
Yeah, so this can be a touchy one, and Jeffrey, I hope you're still watching. HDCP, for those who are not familiar with it, is a form of digital copyright protection. It was invented to make sure that people weren't ripping Blu-rays and DVDs, basically. It's a handshake at a hardware level between the source that's playing the protected content and the display that is displaying it, like a television or a projector. When those two devices are directly connected together, they handshake and say, you are HDCP compliant and certified. I can show you copyrighted protection. Great, move on. Devices that inherently are designed to capture video and record video are not HDCP compliant, which is where you run into issues. Because if that source is always sending HDCP encryption signals, we're going to get no signal from it. And so it can, depending on the device, it can manifest itself differently. Sometimes it's just going to be a solid black screen. Sometimes it'll be static, like old television snow signals. Sometimes it'll just be no signal at all. It still kind of, it changes depending on the device. He mentioned a campus, so I'm guessing he's in a school. I'm betting that he encounters this a lot with newer MacBooks. I'm just going based on my gut reaction because I run into this on a daily basis. More recent MacBooks love to enable HDCP even when you're not using protected content. Why that is, I don't know. Tim Cook, you find his phone number, I guess. But it's a tricky one to overcome because circumventing HDCP when it has to be enabled is legally dubious. You do not have the right to send protected content into a recorder. That is violating the copyright. So that's where it gets messy, right? One of the easiest ways to overcome it, however, though, without telling you how to do so illegally, which I wouldn't know anything about, of course, is to look at your signal chain. So it's just like we were talking about at the beginning. Look at your total signal chain. The most common way that I run into this is they have a source, again, often a MacBook, and it's connected to some sort of signal distribution amplifier, like a Crestron DA that's routing that signal into multiple places. If that also includes, or it might be a simple splitter in other cases, if that also includes a HDCP compliant display, like a computer monitor or a television or a projector, and something like a Pearl or a capture card, then if for some reason the original root source detects those monitors first, it may decide to enable HDCP because it believes that everything in the chain is compliant. If it's something like a fancy Crestron DA, it itself advertises HDCP compliance, but you can turn that off in most of them. So you want to make sure that's turned off, and then hopefully your source never actually turns it on. If it's just a simple splitter, try to make sure that the splitter is set up in a way that it detects your non-compliant outputs first. So quick example there is you might have a simple 1 to 2 HDMI splitter. If it's a good powered splitter, usually the output port number 1 is the master out, and it will be detected first and passed to the source. Connect your Pearl or your capture card to that and connect your monitor to the second output so that hopefully the monitor is not detected as the master and passed on to the source. I hope that makes sense, Jeffrey. Of course, if you do have any other questions about that stuff, again, like I've said, feel free to send us an email or jump on live chat on our website. We're happy to dive into that. We do encounter this all the time. It can be very frustrating. Unfortunately, that's the law, so it gets murky.
You know, I went to film school and we had to watch a lot of copywritten content as part of our academic study, so I can understand some of the frustrations with how that might come into play on a campus.
Right, and it's just one of those funny things, and for anybody who's been keeping an eye on Twitch streaming and YouTube streaming in the past little while, there's been a lot of noise about DMCA with music and all these other things, right? Video is no different. It's still subject to all those same things. So, just because you might be able to questionably play a Hollywood movie in a classroom doesn't mean you have the right to live stream it, because you don't have a performance license for that particular piece of copyrighted material. So there's gray areas with that, but the hardware doesn't care. That's what it boils down to, is the hardware simply doesn't care. And the same is true with music, right? You might actually possess a performance license for a particular piece of music, but if you're trying to stream it on a platform that can't be told in advance that you have a license for it, it doesn't care, and you're going to get a takedown. And so that's very similar to HDCP, but on a more streaming out kind of thing. Yeah. So, you got to be aware of these things. It's the reality of live streaming to be cautious of.
Awesome. I think we have time for maybe just a couple more quick questions.
Sure.
This one, I think maybe this is related to copyright as well. Sam mentioned that he's been having some problems with YouTube shutting off remotely.
Could be.
Could that be perhaps music in his stream that is tagged? What might that?
That's a tricky one, because there could be a bunch of things. So if you have a temporary outage, which could be a bandwidth-related issue on YouTube, if they don't receive new data within a set amount of time, they'll just end the stream. So it could be that, if you're having outages. If you're not having outages, it's probably not that. It's probably something else. Either one, someone's clicking a button incorrectly in the dashboard somewhere, or browsing away from the wrong page at the wrong time, or, as Dan mentioned, it could be a copyright issue where you're getting flagged for music or some other content that you're playing in the stream, and you're getting flagged and they take the stream down. If you do that on YouTube, there's no recourse for that other than just don't play copyrighted material. There is no way to give YouTube advanced warning that you're have a license, even if you do, which I'll be honest, most people do not. They just gamble on it. So, Sam, it's hard without more information, but those are some of the common ones that we run into.
Thanks for that, George. Just quickly scanning the comments here. I just saw a nice comment from Mohammed. He's really excited about the upcoming Pearl Nano. So
you and me both.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Pearl Nano is the newest member of the Epiphan Pearl family. It's going to be a great single channel encoder, but there's a number of other really exciting things about it. Maybe we can just, I don't see any more questions coming in. Maybe you want to just give a very quick summary of what Pearl Nano is. I do have another question from Alex. So Alex, we'll get your question in just a moment, but George, maybe you could just tell us quickly why Pearl Nano is exciting.
Yeah, so Pearl Nano is going to be, the smallest member of the Pearl family. It'll be, a very simple, kind of perfect fit encoder for basic needs. It'll have 2 inputs that you can do some basic compositing with, and very small form factor, very lightweight. It could be powered even using PoE Plus, so you don't even have to necessarily have wall power for it if you have the right network set up to provide PoE. Has a little screen on the front and some buttons so you can get some quick status as well as some control right on the front. It's going to honestly be a great fit for a lot of the smaller road kit style setups, or maybe to tuck it inside of a podium for lecture capture scenarios. There's going to be a lot of cool things. It'll be awesome to hang off the end of your existing production system. So maybe you have like some huge broadcast style mixing console and you do all your production on that. Putting a Nano at the end of that chain is going to be awesome to enable your super high quality production to get out live streaming on a simple device. So yeah, I mean, it's there on our website. Check out epiphan.com and check out the product list for Nano. There's a bunch of details there. There's a wait list. If you want to order one, get on the wait list to make sure something gets allocated to you sooner rather than later. Yeah, so let's get to Alex. Alex's last question here. This is an interesting.
I think you're getting the hook, George. So let's make this a quick one.
They're yanking me here. Alex, multicast works very well in Pearl 2 for a local network in remote rooms, but requires VLC and a computer. Do you have any experience using a more simple set-top box which could play multicast? Samsung Smart TV browser is okay, but unfortunately, church don't. The answer is yes. There are a bunch out there. Typically with set-top boxes that can play multicast, you're looking at professional IPTV style set-top boxes. The ones I personally like are the ones from a company called Xterity. They're definitely a professional box. They're definitely not cheap, but they work extremely well. They're well built. They're durable, metal kind of things. So yeah, the other thing to consider is that if you don't need multicast because you don't have a huge number of concurrent viewers on the local network, you could also do things like enable UPnP, and smart TVs could pick that up as well as a unicast stream. So multicast is really beneficial if you have a huge number of concurrent viewers, or you're trying to distribute it within a digital signage player type of application. So that's. I hope that helps, Alex. But again, if you want some more specific recommendations, feel free to reach out to us, info@epiphan.com, and we can try and help you with that. That'll do it. We're getting the hook, Dan.
We've gotten the hook. I think our producers are flashing all kinds of things on our screens now. I think the reason that this goes as long as it is just because of how passionate we are. And George, the wealth of information that you've been providing today, I'm sure has helped a lot of people. And we've got thank yous coming in from Hillary and Michael.
I hope this was helpful for everyone, and I hope it helps speed up your own problem resolution for your live streams in the future.
Yeah. So thanks again for joining us, and for the people who stuck around the whole time. It was a lot of fun, and thanks for sticking with us right to the end. As always, you can learn more about Pearl and Epiphan products at epiphan.com/products. We can also set up one-on-one demos. So just send an email to info@epiphan.com. We also have a live show on YouTube that happens every single Thursday. So if you want to engage with us on some of the very interesting live streaming topics we have on a weekly basis, it's a great place to do that. You can also find us on Instagram, on Facebook, on all the socially places, as George likes to say.
Yeah.
And The other thing
Like,
I'll just
follow,
note is,
subscribe.
if you have questions that we weren't able to touch on today, Epiphan has a fantastic service department. So, just get in touch with the service department, info@epiphan.com. And the hook is extending out to the front of the stage. It's grabbing you, George. It's grabbing me. I think we need to wrap this up. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.